What is going on, everyone? Tutorial Tim here at Design Academy, and today we're going to be talking about elevation and material design and how it's utilized. So we'll be doing an overview of elevation, which will entail elevation depicting elevation, the elevation hierarchy, and the default elevation set for components. And I have some documentation that I grabbed off of Material Design's website, which you can also access by clicking on this in the exercise file and clicking open link. And then you'll then get access to the elevation page in Material Design, where it discusses all of this and is covered in the contents here in depth. And essentially, elevation is the relative distance between two surfaces along the z-axis. So what is the z-axis? Well, we can go ahead and Google search that. And for those of you who are beginners to this and don't understand the z-axis, it is the third axis, usually representing depth on a three-dimensional grid. It can be used in charts or graphs and whatnot, typically in a Cartesian coordinate system, and the z-axis is perpendicular to both the x and y-axis and is used to plot the value of z, the third unknown in mathematics, which is good to know. And anyways, how this translates in Figma is basically the hierarchy in the layers. You could think of it as like the hierarchy in the layers panel. Say, for example, I have a frame here, and then I have a couple of shapes, and I'm going to offset this color here. And currently, these shapes are being basically utilize the z-index, and you notice that because this rectangle, when I overlap it over the rectangle above it visually, this gray rectangle, and I add this red rectangle there, you'll notice that this red rectangle is higher up on the z-index. And also you could think of that in the layer order as well. I can even change that and drag it below this gray rectangle, meaning that it's now lower on the z-index, the red rectangle. And you can go ahead and move that around. Understand that that is the z-index that is representing the layer order here. And basically what material design does is that it has a set of components, and here you can see a set of default elevation values for all kinds of components. And here we have all of the elevations values that will turn into styles, as they already are in this Figma file locally. And we're going to go ahead and create a couple of them from scratch so you understand how they're built as styles. And we'll also go ahead and do a brief overview about how those are made based off of reading the documentation. So here, again, elevation is measured in dips. And in elevation material design is measuring the distance between surfaces. As you can see here, they're giving you a representation of what this z-index looks like. By utilizing this graph here, this format, to indicate how far a surface is from one another. But again, to us, it looks to us visually, we're seeing this on this flat surface on the screen. But if you were to tilt that view sideways, you could say this is what that would look like in this scenario, where this example number 2 indicates that there's a surface that is one dip, set to 1 dip elevation, and then the other surface is set to 8 dip elevation as viewed from the side view here. And the difference between the two surfaces is 7 dips as viewed from the side angle. And you can represent that with using a drop shadow, and that will indicate the elevation and the distance between these two surfaces. So here's the 1 dip here in this rectangle, and then which is represented from the side view, and then here is elevation being expressed at a higher elevation using 8 dips with much more visual emphasis on the drop shadow, as you can see, and that's also represented here from the side. And there's that distance expressed there. And there's another more complicated example where both surfaces A and B are at the same elevation. A and B are set to 8 dip elevation, and they cast different shadows because surface B is in front of another surface that already has elevation. As you can see, the surface C already has elevation set to 4 dips, And then on top of that, surface B is set to 8 dips, as you can see is represented from the side. And whereas the surface A doesn't have anything below it, and it is set to 8 dips of elevation. So A and B are essentially on the same axis of elevation. It's just that it doesn't have any other surface below it. And you can understand the elevation system, again, is utilized in components, and all material design surfaces and components have elevation values, and surfaces at different elevations do different things, and those things being allowing surfaces to move in front of and behind other surfaces, such as content scrolling behind app bars, and reflecting spatial relationships, such as how a floating action button's shadow indicates it is separate from a card, and focusing attention on the highest elevation. This is commonly seen in components such as dialogues, which temporarily appear in front of other surfaces. And we're going to go ahead and look at some great examples of how these components are in some motion examples. But here's a great example of resting elevation, where by default, this card component here has elevation at the by default set to 1 dip, and then once there's an action taken upon it, sometimes the elevation can change. So that is important to note. So for example, with a button, the elevation will change based upon when you press it. So here in this example, when someone is pressing on this button, you'll see that from the side it goes from 2 dips to 8 dips based on that action, which raises it to the surface, making this a much more immersive experience and interactive, also conveying certain key interactions and progression to the user as they are communicating with their product, which is built on top of material design, for example. And here you can see other examples of elevation here with this card. As it is being dragged, it goes from 1 dip elevation to 8, and is then rises above the previous card as it's above it in the Z index. And here's another example of when you would utilize elevation, where these cards are scrolling, and being on that elevation based system, it is allowed to scroll over the surface that it is currently above, as you can see there. And you can also read other important things, such as understanding the surface overlaps on top of other surfaces and when to use them, which is really important, and also when to use a scrim background in the UI to express that the content above it is at a higher elevation, also to provide more emphasis on the most primary calls to action in that moment in time. And again, more great in-depth analysis on elevation and when you can use motion and elevation together. For example, showing changes in shadow, or displaying overlap, or pushing content around, or scaling that content, or using parallax scrolling. And what we're going to get to now is understanding elevation hierarchy, and basically going over the diagram of default elevation values, which is super important. And we have that in Figma now that we've went over all of that. So we have the set of elevation values, which tells us exactly what components have default elevation values, and this will be super important to implement into our color styles. So in this Figma file, I've already created a set of elevation values, and they're already effect styles in your Figma file, this exercise file. And again, this is the final result of what we'll be making, but I don't just want to just hand this off to you. I want to actually show you how to create these effect styles. So we'll go ahead and create a few of them, and then I'll pause this video and have you build the rest by yourself. So first, I need to teach you how to actually evaluate the values within each of these drop shadows. So here you can see these are all the elevation values used in material design. And again, this one's at the surface level. This doesn't utilize elevation, as you can see, set to 0, 0 dip. And that then can't be an effect style because it doesn't use any effects. That is just the baseline. Just think of 0, 0 as the baseline. And then, of course, one dip is used for the search bar, cards at a rested elevation state by default, as well as the search bar at a rested elevation state, and also switch components. And text buttons are set to 0, and standard side sheet components are set to 0 as well. So let's go ahead and mimic this. I'm going to copy this, and you'll notice that it is attached to the style. I'm going to go ahead and detach that, and you'll notice that these styles are all drop shadows. So I'm going to go ahead and remove all these. So now this is flat here on the right. And one thing we can do is we can manually go in and click on these individual styles, which is very tedious. We can go ahead and do it that way. So if I click on this value, so for example, I could screenshot all of these because I wouldn't want to go back and forth clicking on all of these drop shadows and copying and pasting these properties. So I'm going to show you the long way of doing this, and then I'm going to show you the fast way, so you never do that approach again. So let me just undo that there, and then I'm going to paste this. Here we go. So I'm going to grab this last drop shadow style, and then with that drop shadow style set, I have all 3 drop shadows, and I'm going to recreate the elevation set for 0, 1 dips. So I'm going to go ahead and click on effects. Whoops, I'm going to click the create effect style icon. I have, by default, it selects drop shadow, and it'll give you some default values. So I'm going to go ahead and create this one here. So I'm going to change the blur to 1, and I'm going to set the y-axis value to 1 here, and then I'm going to keep the spread at 0 and change the opacity to 14%, and it's using a color of black, which is 0, 0, 0, 0, 0, 0. And then now I have that first drop shadow style created. You can start to see that this drop shadow is being applied here, but it's very light in the drop shadow color compared to this one, where it's much more sharp and darker on the edges of the rectangle. And I'm going to go ahead and create that second drop shadow, and with that I'm going to just mimic the properties in this drop shadow, and that's set to 1 on the blur, 0 on the spread, and 2 on the y-axis, and an opacity of 12%. Going to hit enter. I now have that second property of drop shadows applied. Then I'm going to go ahead and delete these 2 so I don't get confused, and create my last effect, which is another set of drop shadow. I'm going to go ahead and apply these values again. So 1 on the y-axis, 3 on the blur, 0 spread, and 20% opacity. Once I've created that, you'll notice I now have an exact replica of the drop shadow here. The only difference is that this drop shadow is brand new. It's still the drop shadow from Material Design System. It's just that it's not attached to a style for learning purposes specifically, so you know how to create these drop shadows. And we can go ahead and turn this into a style, but before we turn this into a style, let's go ahead and show you the easy way to do this. So now that we have this style, maybe we go ahead and duplicate the 8-dip based version of this, and it's still attached to an effect style. So I'm going to detach that style. I'm going to duplicate this rectangle, and I'm going to delete all these drop shadows. And what I'm going to do is make sure I have my rectangle selected, and I'm going to hold down Option Command C. And what that allows me to do is copy all of the styles associated with the object I selected, which is the rectangle, and then I can paste those over to my new object by clicking on this rectangle and then hitting Option Command V, and it pastes those exact drop shadow values. You notice that when I pasted it, it implemented those new drop shadow values, and that is much quicker than going in and implementing them manually like I did and referencing screenshots, so I didn't have to individually click on each drop shadow property panel and then do that one by one. That's very annoying. So with that being said, let's utilize that approach now. So here we can just copy over. I'm command clicking on all these I'm command clicking to select the rectangle specifically, and then holding shift command click on all of these rectangles here. And basically what I'm doing is grabbing all of these, and then I'm going to hold down option and drag these over to copy all of them. And you'll notice what we have here is all of these elevation values or effects. All of these rectangles are attached to effect styles, but we don't want to do that. We want to utilize the method of creating drop shadows quickly by copying the properties and pasting them. And to do that, we need to go ahead and unlink, detach all these drop shadow styles. So here we go. We're going to continue to detach these styles. I'm just selecting each one individually, as you can't bulk select these and detach, unfortunately, for effect styles, but you can do that with color styles. So now that we have that applied, I know that these are all in sequential order or proper order. So it goes from 1 dip elevation, 2, 3, 4, 6, 8, 9, 12, 16, and 24. So all I'm going to do is duplicate this real quick, and detach all these drop shadow values. And I'm going to duplicate that again and keep duplicating them on the rectangles I have not created drop shadows for yet. And you'll notice that they're all very flat, which would mean that they're using the 0 dip elevation essentially. And I'm just going to go ahead and click on these, command option C, and then select the object I want to paste the drop shadow to, and then click command option V. And you'll notice that I am now just essentially copying and pasting these effect style properties. So holding down option command C, selecting the new object, and then doing option command V. And I'm just grabbing all of these drop shadow properties and pasting them very quickly. And this is something you can use for color as well. So if I change the color of this, it would copy that color value. It still has the drop shadow, but if I option command C and then select my new object and then option command V, it also copies over that fill value. So it copies all the properties, not just the effect styles, which are the drop shadows in our case. So do take note of that. Option command C, select my new object, option command V, and then do the same thing for the last set of elevation. And this is very important to note. And now that we've built all of this out, we can go ahead and create effect styles out of these. And as you can see, we already have them created. So we can go ahead and mimic a couple. And I'm going to go ahead, and this is our 0-2 dip effect style. So I'm going to go ahead and click on my style icon and click add new style. And then I'm going to type in 0-2 dip. And this is our new effect style. And we now will have 2 variants of that. And then it gets created and it's set at the bottom. The newest styles are then generated at the bottom of this list in the effect styles in the properties panel. I can even go ahead and just create another one. You'll notice that this is now linked to a style, and these aren't yet because I haven't created the color styles. I'm gonna go ahead and click on another one and click on the style icon and create new style. And this is my 24 dip elevation base value. So I got 24 dip there. I'm gonna click create style. I now have 0-2 dip and 24 dip created, but this is solely to showcase to you how to create styles out of these elevation values, because you're going to reuse them time and time again. So I'm just going to actually delete these since we already have them in our file, now that you know how to create effect styles in Figma. And with that being said, the only thing missing from these effect styles is documentation. And basically what I'm referencing is that in these effect styles, we can go ahead and label where this elevation would apply. So I'm going to click on 24 dip, and since we have the table of default elevation values, it tells me what components use that set of elevation. So I can go ahead and click on this edit style icon and add a description, and I can type in use for dialog components, and I'm going to hit tab and it'll save that change. I'm going to hit back, and I'm going to go ahead and select my 16 dip effect style, click edit style, and I'm going to continue to add the description. And currently navigation drawer components and modal bottom sheet and modal side sheet components use this default elevation value. So I'm going to actually go ahead and input that used for these components, being the navigation drawer and modal bottom sheet and modal side sheet. And now that I have that input, it will save that, and you can even go back into your style and edit it and check to see if it saved the description. And I'm gonna continue to input the description, so that way when you publish this and other designers start to use these styles, they can go ahead and click on the description, understand where you would actually apply this elevation style, which is great, useful tool to communicate to your designer, especially when designers don't remember where these styles are being utilized. And here you can see that a lot of components use the default elevation value of 8 dips. And I'm going to go ahead and pause this video, and I want you to go ahead and for the rest of these, for the 8 dip, 6, 4, 3, 2, 1 dip effect styles, I want you to go ahead and reference this table here and input that into the description like we just did for the following effect styles. I'm going to pause this video and I'll catch you when this is done. So now I have completed inputting all the descriptions for the rest of the elevation values. As you can see here, it's a direct reflection of what is labeled in the table of default elevation values in material design. And again, I got these screenshots off of the material design elevation page, which is also a link here in an exercise file if you want to double check things and also soak in more information on elevation itself, because this is not only applicable to material design's design system, but great principles for you to utilize as a foundation for implementing new systems. So that is also something important to take into consideration. And here, again, if I go to the editing these styles, I'm just double checking all my descriptions here, and everything is good to go. So I hope you enjoyed this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.